Bom dia. Estão me ouvindo? Tá ligado? Bom dia a todos e todas e todes. Estou aqui, meu nome é Liv Sovic, estou aqui na qualidade de moderadora para fazer... Ele precisa de um fone de ouvido. Alguém pode pegar para ele? Esse é melhor? É melhor esse microfone? Tá. Não, ele é... Testando. Can you hear? Ok. Então, bom dia a todos e todas e todas. Meu nome é Liv Sovic, eu sou da Escola de Comunicação e eu estou aqui na qualidade de moderadora, quer dizer, vou organizar as falas posterior à apresentação do professor Omer Bartov. Queria falar algumas palavras sobre o professor. Muitos de vocês já assistiram alguma coisa dele, mas eu queria recuperar um pouco do que ele falou ontem na sala Pedro Calmão, porque eu acho que isso, para aqueles que estão seguindo para o segundo capítulo, isso recupera um pouco onde estamos, né? Ele começou, o professor Omer Bartov Dean's professor de História do Holocausto e de Genocídio na Universidade Brown, que é uma das 7 grandes famosas dos Estados Unidos. Ele, então, ontem nos apresentou uma certa história das universidades, né, diante da crise ou da violência em Gaza. Falou de como as universidades de Israel eram considerados baluartes do pensamento independente, mas que rapidamente pessoas com quem ele tinha interlocução mudaram de posição. Falou também das manifestações enormes que teve em universidades estadunidenses do tamanho que não tinha sido visto desde a Guerra do Vietnã. E falou do significado disso, né? De como isso, a repressão a essas manifestações era um ataque, é um caso exemplar da tentativa de silenciar aí. Agora dá de novo? Então, falou de vários aspectos dessa problemática, né, do posicionamento das pessoas diante do sofrimento palestino, diante de uma ocupação e diante da guerra. Professor Bartov trabalha com subjetividades desde seu doutorado, quando estudou a criação das subjetividades, a doutrinação dos soldados nazistas. Então, estamos com uma pessoa que pode nos falar sobre isso. Queria, então, dar a palavra para ele sem mais demora, mas com essa brevíssima apresentação de uma pessoa que me parece que pode nos ajudar muito a pensar sobre como nos posicionarmos aqui também e agora. Obrigado, professor.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this kind introduction. Thank you all for being here in this very comfortably air-conditioned space. I'm sorry that I'm sitting so high up. I feel like I'm in the Supreme Court speaking down to you, but I hope this won't be speaking down, but speaking together. The topic of today's conversation, as was given to me, is between barbarism, genocide, and the extreme right, the place to reflect in a world of multiple crises. And I will address this issue in a couple of minutes. I want to introduce this with a couple of comments. First, last night, I was introduced as the Samuel Pisar Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies, and my title has changed, as you heard today, to the Dean's Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And just between us, entre nous, I will tell you that the title was changed on request of the family of Samuel Pisar. Samuel Pisar was a distinguished lawyer, public person, both in France and in the United States. Among other things, he worked closely with the Clinton administration. He was also a survivor of the Holocaust as a child and wrote a powerful memoir about that. And his family decided to establish a chair in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, and I was privileged to be offered that chair. But following comments, public comments that I'd made over the first year following October 7th, the family requested that the name would no longer be used. So the chair remains, but the name does not. And that gives you some, I had no problem with that. I understood the sensitivity by the family, but it gives you some idea of how difficult it has become for many people to speak their mind. So that's one comment that I wanted to make. We can discuss what are the implications of that for people who have become somewhat uncomfortable about speaking their mind, not as an opinion, simply as a political opinion, but rather as an understanding that they have that they should, as I was saying last night, use their expertise in order to analyze and present to the public their understanding, and why many people don't do that. A second point that I'd like to make about my title is that it says that I'm now the Dean's Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Now, any of you who have given a little bit of thought to what that means would understand that there's a bit of a tautology in this title. Why is it Holocaust and Genocide Studies? Is there a difference between the Holocaust and genocide? Wasn't the Holocaust a genocide? If it was, shouldn't it just be genocide studies? So the contradiction, the difficulty of making a distinction between the Holocaust as a particular type of genocide, a very extreme case of genocide, and genocide as a generic phenomenon that was defined by scholars, but defined also in international law. The tension between the two terms is very much part of the public discussion that we are having now. That is the insistence by some that the Holocaust is a unique event and cannot be compared to any other. And that when you speak about other genocides, or when you use the term genocide, are you speaking in order to undermine the uniqueness of the Holocaust. So this is a second major issue that is encapsulated simply in the title that I hold now and for the next 2.5 years before I'm fully retired. Okay, that's just one preliminary comment for our discussion. The second that I want to make before I get into the sort of intricacies of the topic that I was given is closely related to it. A couple of days ago, I was approached by a Brazilian journalist with a couple of questions, which I managed to answer yesterday when I had a little bit of time. And I want to share that with you because that's quite relevant to our topic. He asked me first, and I'll read out his question, how do you analyze the real threat posed by neo-Nazis in Germany? How many of them are there, and what is their strength in German society? And so my answer to that was that the number of neo-Nazis has risen in Germany. It seems that by 2023, the number was estimated as just under 40,000. Now, Germany is a large populous country, so within such a large country, 40,000 is a relatively marginal number, although the rise, of course, itself is alarming. But this number represents the growth, as I was saying, of extreme right tendencies, which are much more prevalent and are reflected in the rhetoric, in the meteoric rise of the AfD, of the Alternative for Deutschland party. That's the far-right party in Germany. That party is now the second largest political party in Germany. Now that is very significant. Unlike the 40,000 neo-Nazis, the AfD is now 120% of the representatives in the German parliament, in the Bundestag, and is the second largest party. This is unprecedented since the 1920s. That is, in the 1920s, after 1929, as some of you would know, the Nazi Party, which was a marginal party since its establishment in the early 1920s, for the first time became first the second largest party and then the largest party in the Reichstag, in the German parliament at the time. And since then, after 1945, there was never a far-right party of that nature that reached this amount of power. So that is very significant and gives a great deal of reason for concern. Now, we have to put this in context. And the context is that far-right parties of this nature have also expanded in many other countries, not only in Germany. You may know, of course, the case of Italy, where a far-right party now actually controls the executive. Prime Minister Meloni is Prime Minister of Italy, and her party has roots that go back to fascism in Italy. This is the case in France, of course, where Marine Le Pen created a party that has about 40% of the electorate. And there's every reason to think that in the next elections, it will win the presidency of France. That, in many cases, has been the case in the Netherlands, where there's a very strong far-right party, in Sweden, in Spain, most recently in Portugal, where the Chega party has become a big player in Portuguese politics, in Sweden, and so forth. And of course in Britain, where expectations are, with Labour sinking fast, that there would be much greater power for the far right. So this is certainly not just a case of Germany, although everyone is worried, of course, in Germany itself, but in Europe as a whole, because of German history, or European history, with the tremendous damage that Germany did in World War II, and because Germany remains today the most powerful European country. So all of this is a much larger phenomenon than speaking only about these 40,000 neo-Nazis in Germany. I should add, of course, that there is an American version of this, and that we know that what propelled Trump to power twice, the American president, is the growth of what has come to be known as MAGA, of the Make America Great Again movement, which has very extreme elements in it that have become increasingly influential within the Republican Party in the United States. So all of this has to be taken into account, and what I was implying in this response was that if we look only at neo-Nazis or neo-fascists, that does not really explain the phenomenon well enough. There's something else going on which is much greater than those particular, still relatively marginal groups. So the second question that this journalist asked me was, as he put it, within German policy, how is the neo-Nazi ideology focused, or what is it focused on? And how do I see the level of influence of this ideology in the Bundestag, in the German parliament, and the German government? And here, my response was that I believe it's much better to focus on the AfD rather than on these disparate neo-Nazi groups, which don't seem to have a clear ideology beyond what we know, racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and extreme nationalism. AfD ideology, on the other hand, and that's why the AfD has won so many voters, resonates in Germany because of sectors of the population that oppose the influx of migrants. There's a very strong, certainly since former Chancellor Angela Merkel allowed about 1 million migrants from Syria to enter Germany, and everyone celebrated that. That's a new Germany. The political implications of that in Germany, in Austria as well, are clearly connected to the growth in the support for the AfD. Opposition to Muslims in Germany, which has grown by leaps and bounds. There are about 5 million German citizens who are Muslims in Germany today. And one doesn't speak much about that because we think of these countries as being different, say, from countries like Brazil or like the United States. 20%, a fifth of the population of Germany are people of citizens of Germany, are either people who were not born in Germany or children of people who were not born in Germany. So the profile of the German population, and that would go for many other European countries as well, has changed without Germans even coming to terms with that, even knowing how to deal with that, not having any tradition of understanding that. There's also part of the support for the AfD goes back to the sense that especially in East Germany, and you remember that there was once a GDR, DDR, communist Germany on the other side of what was the wall, which has disappeared. in those parts of Germany, there's a sense that ordinary, so-called ordinary Germans were left behind, that they have fewer job and career opportunities, especially for the young. There's a great deal of resentment as well, especially among young Germans, about what has come to be called in right-wing circles in Germany the Schuldkult, the cult of guilt. And what is meant by the cult of guilt, it's the repeatedly reminding young Germans of their historical responsibility for the Holocaust, for Nazi crimes, going back 3-4 generations. And by the way, as part of German integration policy of people coming from outside of Germany and outside of Europe, that part of becoming integrated into Germany, becoming German means that they too have to take upon themselves this historical responsibility for the Holocaust, even if they have come from Syria and see no reason why they should feel responsible for what Aryan, so to speak, Germans did in World War II. So this sense of historical responsibility that was one of the main accomplishments of German coming to terms with the past has become a domestic issue both for integration of migrants and a cause of resentment among growing cohorts of young Germans, especially from East Germany, but not only from East Germany. And there is, I don't know how many of you saw the lecture that was given by the owner of Tesla to the AfD just before the elections in Germany, Musk. But Musk gave a lecture on video to about 3,000 supporters of the AfD just before its extraordinary electoral victory, in which he said the Germans should feel proud again about being German and should feel proud about German history. And he was speaking to a sentiment that exists in Germany, especially among the young. These are elements that are propelling, factors that are propelling that party, the AfD, into a major political position in Germany that have to be reckoned with, that can't be dismissed. We don't have to agree with any of this, but we have to understand this combination of socioeconomic resentment and of being shamed, feeling of being shamed as Germans, along with a sense that mainstream parties, such as the SPD, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, which used to be the largest party in Germany and now has declined dramatically, but also the Conservative Party, have failed to deliver on the promises that they made to their voters, which is one reason that their voters are abandoning them. And that's really what's reflected in the electoral map of Germany. Now, just to make a kind of historical analogy here, and these analogies, one has to be very careful while making them. The political map in Germany, in France, in Britain, and in other countries is changing not only because of the switch from the left to the right. It's changing because traditional parties are beginning to disappear. And that's very much what happened in the late 20s and early 1930s, certainly in Germany. The entire political map changed, not only a shift from left to right, but the traditional parties disappeared. We have to keep that in mind, why that happens, and what does one do about that, and how is that related to extremist policies. Now, the last question that this journalist asked me was, would I say that the AfD is a neo-Nazi party? Or, he asked, does it maintain links with neo-Nazis? And what is the role of the neo-Nazis in this party, and how do I see the capability of the AfD of gaining power inside Germany? And this sort of begins to get to the point that I'll talk about in a moment. So what I said was that my sense is that it's a mistake to speak about the AfD and other populist European parties, including MAGA, or speaking about such heads of state as Putin or Orban, etc., as neo-Nazi or neo-fascist, or simply as fascist. I don't think it's helpful. And that's not because I think that they're wonderful leaders and we should all vote for them or support them, but because I think that using this term prevents understanding of the phenomenon that we are observing. Now, obviously, there are historical and ideological links between them and previous regimes, going back whether to fascism or Nazism or Stalinism. But the current phenomenon has distinct features, and those features need to be recognized instead of confusing them with 1930s policies. The world has changed since. And in this sense, I think that while there are connections with neo-Nazis or neo-fascists in Italy, these new parties, and again, think of Meloni and Le Pen, have rebranded themselves in an effort to emancipate themselves from their Nazi and fascist roots, and thereby to appeal to more people. There are still people who remember how the Nazi and fascist parties ended up, right? That's not a good memory. Whatever you think about the good years, they ended up in being defeated and these countries being destroyed. So, for instance, the AfD, or for that matter, Meloni's Italy or Le Pen's party, are not calling to conquer new lands or territories, which was a main slogan, of course, of these parties in the past. The Nazis wanted Lebensraum. You don't hear the AfD speaking about Lebensraum, living space. The fascists wanted to reinstate the Roman Empire. You don't really hear Meloni speaking about the Roman Empire, as far as I can tell. The appeal of these parties, of these ideologies, and when they are in power, and we don't have many of them in power yet, fortunately, is to national pride and values, to traditional family values. Meloni made a big deal out of that. And against foreigners and migrants, against political, economic, and intellectual elites, of course academic elites, and largely in favor of insularity, of cutting themselves off from international organizations and focusing on improving the lot of, so to speak, real Germans or real Italians, meaning our people, white people, rather than all these other people who have migrated to our countries, or French, of course. At the same time, these parties and these movements are very savvy with social media and appeal to the young, not so much with the message of expansionist nationalism, but of reasserting ethnic and economic security. And I think that if we consider that rhetoric, we will come much closer to understanding the appeal of these parties than simply by saying, oh, they are just like Hitler and Mussolini. Okay, that's my responses to this journalist, and now I'm going to speak a little bit about the actual topic for today. And I remind you again, between barbarism, genocide, and the extreme right, the place to reflect in a world of multiple crises. So let me start by talking about the post-1945 order, the kind of legal and political order that was established in the wake of the fall of these regimes, the Nazi and fascist regimes, and the victory, as it was called then, of democracy. This was made of several elements, and we need to keep this in mind because these elements are now fraying and in danger of falling apart. We had the Military Tribunal of Nuremberg, 1945, which attempted to bring to account the main culprits, the main living culprits of the Nazi regime, and to show that there was no impunity, that eventually these people would pay a price, as the Allies had promised they would in the years prior to the final defeat of Nazi Germany. That was based on a concept that was created in 1945 of crimes against humanity. That regime, particularly the Nazi regime, was guilty of crimes against humanity. We can talk much more about what that means. What does it mean, a crime against humanity? In a sense, this is a crime that is not simply against the people who are being killed or tortured and victimized. It's a crime against the very concept of a shared humanity. It's a crime that all human beings should feel ashamed that it was carried out, should feel responsible for, should feel a duty to stop, because it's an attempt to destroy the very concept of a shared humanity. So this was at the core of this notion of a crime against humanity. This was followed by the Genocide Convention. I spoke a little bit about it yesterday, I think, in 1948, so 3 years later, because genocide, although it's mentioned in Nuremberg, is not part of the indictment. And genocide, as we know, was a newly coined term for a crime that was not well defined before, that was identified by the man who coined that term, Raphael Lemkin, a Polish-Jewish lawyer who ended up fleeing from Europe and coming to the United States and coined this term in 1944. And genocide is the attempt to destroy a particular group in whole or in part as such. So it's a crime against groups, not against individuals. Individual victims of genocide become victims of genocide as members of the group that the perpetrators are trying to destroy. And these two concepts, a crime against humanity and genocide, are the two main legal concepts that come as a response to the devastation that was wrought on Europe by Nazism until 1945. This was also anchored in the Geneva Accords of 1949, which expanded on the Accords of 1929, which is about war crimes. So the third element of this international legal regime is war crimes. War crimes were already identified before World War II, but the concept was both expanded and then anchored in international law. In order to be able to adjudicate these crimes, the UN, the newly established UN, established for itself an International Court of Justice, often referred to as the World Court, the ICJ. And all members of the United Nations have to abide by the rulings of the ICJ, of the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice is not about individuals, but about states. So it has two roles. One role is to act as an advisory to the UN. So the UN can say, go to the ICJ and say, how do you adjudicate the legality of the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza? And recently, the ICJ ruled on that after several years of adjudicating that, and ruled that it was illegal and had to be stopped as soon as possible. That's a legal ruling by the ICJ, and all signatory countries, all members of the UN, are supposed to abide by this ruling, to treat that particular case, this advisory by the ICJ, as a binding legal advice. It doesn't mean that they do that, but that's what they agreed to do. So the second important role of the ICJ is to resolve disputes between states. And these disputes between states could be, and have been in recent years, about allegations of genocide. Again, specifically to our case, which is an important case, of course, South Africa, the state of South Africa, declared that it has a dispute with the state of Israel by calling what Israel was carrying out in Gaza a genocide. And it appealed to the not the Supreme Court, to the ICJ, and the ICJ brought South Africa and Israel to present their cases in late 2023, issued provisional measures on the assumption that it is plausible that there could be genocide occurring in Gaza, and is still in the process of adjudicating whether that is indeed the case or not. It's also dealing with other allegations of genocide, about the genocide of the Rohingya, if it is one, by Myanmar, and about the war in Russia. Now, the problem, the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, the problem with the ICJ, as is with all courts, that the ICJ adjudicates matters, but cannot enforce its rulings. Just like in any national court, a court may make a decision and says, okay, this person is guilty and has to be arrested. But the judges can't go out to the street and arrest the person, they use the police. In the case of the ICJ, the enforcement arm, because it's part of the UN, is the Security Council. And the Security Council was created also immediately after World War II as part of the structure of the UN, and it has 5 permanent members who have veto power. And any member of the ICJ with veto power who vetoes any decision by the Security Council, that decision cannot be enforced. So in the case of Russia and Ukraine, Russia has veto power. The ICJ issued provisional measures to force Russia to change its policies vis-a-vis Ukraine, and Russia couldn't care less because Russia has veto power. Provisional measures issued for Israel by the ICJ. Israel has not acted accordingly. And by the way, one of these provisional measures was signed by the Israeli member of the of the ICJ. These are ad hoc members that are appointed when a particular country is under investigation by the ICJ. Aaron Barak, a former Supreme Court justice, he too signed one of the provisional measures that had to do with humanitarian provisions to Palestinians in Gaza, but Israel did nothing. And he didn't have to do anything because it is a proxy of the United States, and the United States has veto power in the ICJ. So that's one important but flawed, of course, instance that tries to adjudicate those cases based on the international legal system that was put into place after 1945. Now, as long as there was a Cold War, there were no cases of genocide presented to the UN. It was only in the 1990s, following the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, in the sense that there was no longer a Soviet Union, that political event was followed immediately by two genocides, not unrelated to that. One in the former Yugoslavia, and the second in Rwanda. And because of those two cases, and because there was now no Cold War, and we were not in a unipolar world, in a bipolar world, two international tribunals were established. The International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the ICTY, and the International Tribunal for Rwanda, the ICTR. And those operated along the same lines as the Nuremberg Tribunal of 1945. Now, I should say that the Genocide Convention of 1948 recommended the creation of an international criminal court, so that there would not just be ad hoc tribunals such as Nuremberg or these other two tribunals of the 1990s, but that there would be a permanent court, international criminal court, that would deal with individual responsibility, not with state responsibility, but individual responsibility. Heads of state, other political figures or military figures involved in war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Those main crimes that were anchored in law after 1945. That finally happened with the Rome Statute of 1988 and the establishment of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, in 2002. So since then, we actually have a permanent court that is supposed to adjudicate individual responsibility and guilt for these crimes. Again, this is an international body, and international bodies have the problem that they have to operate within the rules of international law, which mean that states have a great deal of influence on how they act, and stronger states, bigger states, have more influence than smaller states. That's the problem of the international community in which we live. And this came to a head with the creation of the ICC, because there are several countries that do not recognize the Rome Statute and are not signatories to the Rome Statute, unlike being signatories, being members of the UN and being signatories to the Genocide Convention. That includes Israel, Italy, Germany, the UK, the US 40 years later, but the US also became a signatory to the Genocide Convention, and Brazil as well. But the ICC, based on the Rome Statute, several states have declined to see themselves as being under the jurisdiction of the ICC, and those states include the United States, Sudan, Russia, and Israel. Now it is, and I'll just say in parentheses here, that as you probably know, the ICC took out arrest warrants for 3 Hamas leaders, all 3 of whom have since been killed by the IDF, and 2 Israeli leaders, Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, at the time the defense minister. They were not charged with genocide. They are charged with war crimes and crimes against humanity. They are charged with enforced population transfer, with murder, and with there's one other crime, torture, I believe. But not, so these are war crimes and crimes against humanity. They've not been charged, as far as we know, with genocide. All states that recognize the ICC are duty-bound. If a person is under indictment by this court, if they come to their own sovereign territory, to arrest them and hand them over to The Hague, to the ICC. Again, it doesn't mean that it necessarily happens, and as we saw most recently, the German Chancellor visited Israel. Netanyahu is not trying to go to Germany, but by visiting Israel, in a sense, the German Chancellor is flouting this duty to recognize the ICC's jurisdiction. It is, of course, and Netanyahu, of course, has visited the United States numerous times. There's an interesting legal aspect here. Israel has claimed that because it doesn't recognize the ICC, the ICC can't rule about its war in Gaza, and the ICC has argued that because the state of Palestine has joined the Rome Statute, it does recognize the ICC, and these crimes were committed in the territory, in occupied territory of Palestine, that is in Gaza, then its ruling holds. So it has standing in legal language to be able to adjudicate these crimes. So this is the kind of framework that was created, and I'm talking a little bit about what that means, because obviously it's flawed. And there's great room for improvement, but there is a framework that is important to recognize. It does mean that this is not a completely lawless world, that the international community, with all its various compromises, did create a system that was supposed to be based on the notion of never again. That is, never again the kind of crimes that were committed by the Nazis, that if they happen, people would be brought to account and they should know it. And countries should be involved in trying to stop them. I should add, the Genocide Convention officially is called the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. So all signatory states of the Genocide Convention, that's why it's important to recognize genocide when you see it. All signatory states of the Genocide Convention are duty-bound to prevent it if they see it from about to happen. And they don't have to wait for international courts to tell them that it already happened. They need to act when they believe it's about to happen or is happening, and they're duty-bound to punish those who carried it out, even after it's over. They can't say, okay, it's over, now we can move on. They're duty-bound to punish those who carried that crime out. And all the states involved in the various crises that we're seeing now are signatories to that convention. Okay, so now the international order, of course, is crumbling, and that's the problem. So why is this happening? In some ways, while I said that the collapse of communism and the end of a bipolar world made it possible to confront genocide for the first time with these international tribunals, what we have seen in recent years is that we are tilting toward a world that has similarities with the 19th century. That's very much the kind of world that people like Donald Trump would like to see. It's a world where several great powers, let's say the United States, Russia, and China, are seeking to return to the order where large states, powerful states, determine the fate of smaller states by agreement between themselves. So let's say in this kind of world, the US and Russia decide the fate of Ukraine. The US says, okay, we'll let Ukraine keep West Ukraine, Russia can take East Ukraine, in the middle we'll install some government. You don't need to talk with Ukraine about it. We are the big boys and we determine what will happen to smaller countries. And nobody can do anything about it because who is going to resist us? That's the kind of direction that we are moving into, and of course it is always being reflected. Is this on? No. This is working now, I think, right? One. It's working, I think, but it's I have to speak into it like this. Yeah, I have to eat the microphone. Hey. Okay, I'll accelerate this now. So this kind of fracturing of the international order, both the legal order and the state order, is reflected in what we are seeing and what we have seen for the past few years since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, followed by the Israeli operation in Gaza. What we see is that there's a shredding of international law and of the post-war order. So we know, of course, that Russia invaded Ukraine illegally. One of the main charge in Nuremberg was that Germany committed the war against the peace. This was the overriding charge in Nuremberg. A war against the peace means, of course, a war against the peace means, of course, a war of aggression. A war of aggression is illegal by international law. And obviously Russia invaded Ukraine illegally, whatever excuses it tried to prevent. Whatever happens, however that war ends, there's a high likelihood that this event is not only shredding international law, it's shredding the entire international system that was put together in Europe after 1945 and then remade after 1991. Is this working? Yeah? Okay. That is that the next steps for Russia under Putin would be to, once he settles his issue with Ukraine, is to continue expanding Russian power to areas that had been ruled by the Soviet Union and prior by the Russian Empire in Eastern Europe, and to do so through the same mechanism of coming to the rescue, so to speak, of ethnic Russian minorities. This is, of course, a system that was used by Nazi Germany in the 1930s. And that if NATO and the United States don't stand up to Russia now, one wonders whether they would do so in the case of a small state such as Latvia that has a large Russian minority, or in the case of Estonia, or in the case of Lithuania, which is why many of these countries, not least Poland, are now rearming, which is why Germany has now passed a conscription law. So this entire balance of power that was created after 1945 is also in danger of collapsing, and if it does, then that's one way of returning to the power politics of the 19th century, that despite all the faults of the system put into place after 1945 would be a much worse alternative. Sorry. Now, of course, in the case of Gaza, what we've seen is a country, the country of Israel, being able to act with almost complete impunity for well over 2 years, carrying out what were clearly systematic war crimes, crimes against humanity, which is all bad enough and should have been stopped, and according to most genocide scholars and experts in international law, carrying out genocide without not only no intervention to stop it, but in fact those very countries that claim to be the defenders of international law and human rights supporting Israel with arms, economically and politically, including Germany presenting itself as a supporter of Israel in the appeal of South Africa to the ICJ on the question of genocide. So this is clearly a case in which Israel, because it has the full protection up to now at least of the United States, is along with its allies shredding the entire system of international law and undermining the faith of publics in it. Now, this, I would say, is also the opening for the emergence and legitimization of the extreme right. And where is the connection here? So part of this political change is itself a reflection of the rise of social resentment and populist politics. And I think we need to understand the connection between these elements. We don't know what sort of world we're going to end up in. None of us, I think, at least I'm not a prophet, maybe some of you are, but we don't know exactly where things will end up, but we can at least make some predictions. I'd say that the old, as I said earlier, that the old socialist, social democratic, progressive, labor, and democratic parties across Europe, in the United States, it's actually also the case very much in Israel, are on the wane. And the main reason for that, I mean, there are all kinds of reasons, but the main reason, the overriding reason, is that they failed to deliver on their promises. And that the public in these countries have lost faith in them. This is also in large part vis-a-vis the conservative parties. The traditional conservative parties, whether you're talking about the British Conservative Party or you're talking about conservative forces in France, or you're talking about the traditional Likud party in Israel, or you're talking about the CDU in Germany, the traditional supporters of the conservative politics have also lost the support of large parts of the electorate. And so as a result of this, and this is the kind of overlap or similarity or analogy that one can make with the 1930s, is that people are looking for what was called at the time a third path. There was a scholar of French fascism, Zev Sternel, who taught at the Hebrew University, who wrote an important book called Ni droite ni gauche, neither right nor left, which was exactly an analysis of what fascism as it formed in France was about. Neither right nor left. The loss of faith in the traditional party system and looking for something else. In many ways, of course, fascism and Nazism promised national socialism, a term that was coined originally in French, not in German, which was that we will provide social assistance, social responsibility to our own populations within a nationalist politics. We're not universally socialist, we are national socialists. That was the kind of third path that was offered. Now, one similarity is also the reliance on fear and the appeal to neo-Nazi and neo-fascist groups that exist, as I said, in Germany, in France, in Britain, in the Netherlands, but are not the majority and are not getting vast numbers of voters. They are in the tens of thousands. But these parties, these new populist parties, are appealing to these groups and are integrating them into the new party. And in a sense, they're claiming to be disciplining them. And this, too, is very much what happened with fascist parties in the interwar period that took in particular radical elements and claimed to discipline them within a larger party with a much greater appeal to the population. But I want to talk a little bit about what now all these parties and all these movements have in common. First of all, and I think we can see it across the board, they present themselves as disruptors of the old political order, precisely this order that people feel has betrayed them, that is corrupt. They appeal to a people's democracy. They say it doesn't matter what, say, the Supreme Court says. The Supreme Court doesn't represent us. We are now in power. We voted people in. And the Supreme Court is just a bunch of people who were appointed. So it's an appeal to this kind of popular or people's democracy. It has to do with the destruction or coordination of the entire legal establishment, which is in many of these countries the only bulwark against executive power. It campaigns against political, intellectual, academic, and economic elites. It always presents itself as a struggle, as a rebellion against elites. It uses police, army, mob, or militia violence and intimidation, and it uses the military for enforcement of the regimes or the leaders rather than any identifiable national goals. And you can find that with Putin or with Netanyahu or with Trump or Erdogan. One recent example, of course, is the normalization in the United States of using the military within American cities, which has been traditionally never done. And that normalizes the use of the military for these purposes. Some of this dates back in a number of countries, I believe also here, but you can correct me. The use of the military to enforce enclosures during the pandemic. And the links between the pandemic and the rise now of this kind of populist measures can be traced in various countries. But I won't go into it. There is a rhetoric always of making the state or the nation greater. So the sort of making America great again slogan that Trump hit on is across the board. Of course, he goes back, it has a long history. And I'll conclude with 2 points. Clearly, first of all, these movements or regimes, if they come to power, reject any critical view of that nation's past. That's a very important element of speaking about the need to present the past of the nation as a glorious past. That's part of the strong inclination to discipline universities, not least to discipline historians. Never to look critically at the past, not to speak about the difficult past, as the Poles call it, but to use the past only to glorify the nation in the past and toward the future. And the second important element here is targeting minorities of all kinds, whether they're national minorities, ethnic minorities, migrants, as hampering the development of the nation, as standing in the way of making the nation great again, and as sucking up its resources, as being parasites on the majority group. And that's very common rhetoric wherever you look. So what is the final and crucial point that I want to make here? I think that what we see now, and I'm afraid that's what we saw also in the 1930s, is that opposition forces, which might say everything that, or some at least of what I've said today, have failed, and are continuing to fail, I think, to find a new way of addressing this direction that does not fall back on all kinds of cliches, of mocking these forces as fascist, but instead charts a new path forward. There is really, to my mind, a failure in academia, in intellectual circles, in political circles, to address the issues not only by dismissing those forces, by saying, oh, they're just fascists, but by addressing the issues that they claim to be addressing, that they have recognized, by trying to craft new social policies, new ideologies that are not based only on the past, but that address the current concerns of populations. And without doing that, I think that these forces may well win in the political arena. And if they do, then the only way to remove them would be, as happened in the middle of the 20th century, after an enormous amount of destruction, when people finally realized how destructive these forces were. And in order to avoid that, I think it behooves all of us, especially people at universities who are being paid to sit and think and write, and to try and craft another way of addressing the real social, political, ideological, demographic, climatic issues that we are facing today as a political path forward. Okay, thank you.
Então, não sei se tem alguém já que gostaria de fazer pergunta, comentário. Sim.
Oi, obrigado, professor Omer. Eu queria fazer 3 pontos, que na verdade são parte da mesma pergunta. A primeira questão começa falando sobre uma relação complexa entre uma categoria, o genocídio, e outra categoria, holocausto. Você diz, é uma categoria que repete a si própria e que uma delas é um nome próprio vinculado às suas vítimas. Nesse sentido, a primeira pergunta que eu queria fazer é se é possível que a gente perceba, a partir de uma perspectiva da dimensão identitária, de que é chegado o momento da gente entender o risco que é dar nome próprios para genocídios específicos, né? Quando a gente trata um genocídio por um nome próprio, a gente vincula o genocídio com as suas vítimas, estabelecendo uma relação ontológica e dificultando comparações e advertências sobre próximos genocídios. Principalmente quando essas vítimas passam por um processo de embranquecimento e ocidentalização, como o caso dos judeus. Nesse caso, nunca mais só se trata de holocausto e não de genocídios. Muito pelo contrário. Em alguns momentos, os genocídios são parte de um projeto para salvar o Ocidente, e os judeus são as últimas vítimas, as únicas vítimas possíveis. O segundo ponto é sobre uma espécie de... Eu escrevi em hebraico, magefat, como se fala em português, uma... Como é em inglês, magefá? In English, how it say it? Praga. Epidemia de negacionismo. Aqui, na América do Sul, você tem uma certa epidemia de negacionismo sobre a ditadura militar, por exemplo. Né? No Brasil, nós tivemos Bolsonaro, que produziu, na sua posse, o negacionismo da ditadura militar de maneira muito clara. Mas a gente tem também Milei na Argentina, que é um caso importante, porque é um caso de um Estado que produziu punição contra o seu regime ditatorial e produziu um elemento importante sobre a memória da ditadura. Mesmo assim, tem um presidente que estabelece, principalmente sua vice-presidente, uma política clara de negação da ditadura. E, principalmente, ao que tudo indica, o futuro presidente do Chile, que tem uma relação profunda não só com o esquecimento e a negação da ditadura, mas com a defesa dos crimes de Pinochet. Se você falou sobre o que acontece nos Estados Unidos, com a espécie de um passado glorificante dos Estados Unidos, a negação da escravidão, que também é o caso no Brasil, a Alemanha, gradativamente, de maneira muito cuidadosa, o partido de extrema-direita, relativizando grupos específicos, o próprio nazismo. Eu queria saber o que você acha dessa epidemia de negacionismo e, fazendo um pouco o que você fez ontem, o que deu errado, numa perspectiva do Ocidente, como é que o Ocidente não consegue produzir uma política pública efetiva que evite esses negacionismos. E, por último, falando um pouco da universidade, aqui no Brasil nós tivemos agora um combate muito poderoso contra a aprovação da IRA, né? IRA, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, Aliança Internacional de Lembrança do Holocausto, que seria aprovada justamente por um ex-ministro do Bolsonaro no Congresso Nacional, e o Brasil se retirou de membro observante dessa IRA e produziu um certo enfraquecimento desse processo. Eu queria saber o que você acha do uso político das universidades na defesa de grupos específicos em relação à construção de uma arquitetura de memória que defenda grupos específicos, estabeleça uma espécie de vínculo com uma história e apague a possibilidade de outras histórias. Você acha arriscado que a IRA, o atual governo do Brasil, tenta, em algum sentido, voltar a falar sobre a participação da IRA, ou pelo menos tentar relativizar a saída da IRA? Você acha a IRA perigosa para a liberdade acadêmica? Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado, professor Bartov. Eu vou fazer a pergunta, então, em português. Acho que a gente está tendo uma ótima tradução. Ontem, na sua apresentação, né, nós falamos um pouco sobre os efeitos de estruturas de financiamento da educação, né, para vulnerabilizar especialmente a intelectualidade como participantes protagonistas nessa resistência a movimentos extremistas, a esse negacionismo. E aí, assistindo agora a sua apresentação de hoje, eu acabei fazendo uma conexão com o debate trazido pela Clara Matei sobre o papel das políticas baseadas em austeridade, políticas neoliberais, né, amparadas na austeridade como quase que uma ferramenta sabotadora do progresso econômico e social, como isso teria favorecido a emergência desses movimentos extremistas, né, criando ali uma insatisfação econômica que alimentou ali certos anseios e certas frustrações, né, na população branca, talvez, e como isso acabou, né, desembocando em vários movimentos de extrema-direita. A gente tem o trumpismo MAGA nos Estados Unidos. Eu acho que algo muito parecido aconteceu aqui no Brasil. Mas aí me vem uma segunda questão, porque da mesma forma que a austeridade adotada por governos progressistas acabou permitindo que esses movimentos se tornassem bem-sucedidos nos Estados Unidos e no Brasil, por exemplo, e na Argentina agora com Milei, a manutenção dessas estratégias de austeridade talvez tenha sido aquilo que acabou nos salvando de uma vitória mais avassaladora desses movimentos. Digo isso porque no Brasil, por exemplo, Bolsonaro levou muito tempo até descobrir que ele podia fingir que era adepto da responsabilidade fiscal, da austeridade, sem necessariamente usar isso, principalmente quando isso fosse inconveniente para a sua própria manutenção do poder, né? No final do governo ele descobriu isso e acabou realizando vários gastos ali eleitoreiros que quase viraram o jogo eleitoral no final. É muito parecido com a postura do Donald Trump, né, que ainda não abraçou um pragmatismo, né, mais gastador ali, mesmo porque a austeridade ela pode funcionar como uma arma para você perseguir as partes do Estado que são inconvenientes a você, né? Por exemplo, o Bolsonaro usava a austeridade para atacar as universidades, poderia continuar usando, mas ele pode muito bem esquecer do compromisso com a austeridade quando for para comprar voto de caminhoneiro e de taxista, como ele tentou fazer no final. E isso é algo que o Donald Trump parece ainda não ter percebido, né? Pelo menos completamente. Já usou um pouquinho de pragmatismo, por exemplo, para salvar a Argentina, né, simplesmente criando dólares quando foi conveniente. Mas, nesse sentido, talvez isso seja a parte que ainda falta para esses governos se tornarem verdadeiramente poderosos, né, como o elemento faltante nos projetos do início do século passado, né? Porque o sucesso da Alemanha nazista tinha muito a ver com um mérito econômico muito grande, né? Um projeto econômico que dava muito certo, porque em algum momento, né, você tinha realmente planejadores econômicos como Chart que entendiam, né, que um Estado sem restrição fiscal, um Estado que descobre como superar sua restrição externa, né, inclusive deixando de pagar uma dívida de guerra impagável, é um Estado que pode agora mobilizar recursos para o seu projeto. Então, meu medo hoje é que os nossos líderes extremistas descubram essa ferramenta e aí a gente talvez realmente não consiga mais se livrar deles sem aquele processo doído que você descreveu, de eventualmente ter que enfrentar os ataques mais destrutivos deles e eventualmente a né, das guerras e mortes que eles conseguem produzir. E aí eu pergunto aí o que você acharia dessa questão.
Bom dia, muito obrigado pela sua palestra, foi muito interessante. Eu não consegui assistir a de ontem, né? Eu sou farmacêutico, então vou pedir desculpas antecipadas se a minha pergunta for uma pergunta muito ignorante, mas eu gostaria de que o senhor pudesse falar um pouco da diferença entre genocídio e limpeza étnica. Como o senhor falou das duas categorias, Holocausto, genocídio, lembrado pelo professor Wehrmacht aqui, e aí tentando fazer uma relação, quando o senhor for fazer essa distinção entre genocídio e limpeza étnica, em relação a o que ocorreu em 48, colocado como Nakba, né, catástrofe chamada pelos palestinos, e se um genocídio ele vem depois de uma limpeza étnica. Se a limpeza étnica é um primeiro movimento que a gente assiste logo após um genocídio, ou se não existe relação entre essas duas categorias, limpeza étnica e genocídio. Tá, muito obrigado.
Boa tarde, professor. Um prazer ouvir sua palestra novamente. A minha pergunta ela se relaciona ao exercício de comparação e de similaridades que o senhor trouxe em relação a esses dois períodos, um dos quais é o fato de que minorias sociais estariam minando os recursos e seriam seriam um grande problema, né, a ser combatido. Eu gostaria de saber um pouco mais sobre em que medida essa produção de inimigos nesses períodos, né, de graves crises sociais são, de fato, um fator relevante, né, e qual a relevância que esses inimigos assumem na produção de projetos de projetos antidemocráticos ou projetos de destruição de grupos sociais.
Thank you very much for all these questions. Let me start with a question by the pharmacist on ethnic cleansing, because that's the sort of most straightforward. Ethnic cleansing is not well defined in international law. The term came into use during the war in Yugoslavia. It was used by the Serbs. Although equivalent terms were used already in World War I and even before in the Balkan Wars. In international law, the equivalent term, which is not entirely equivalent, is forcible displacement. And forcible displacement is a war crime, it's a crime against humanity, and if it occurs under the general heading of an attempt to destroy a group in whole or in part, it can be part of an indictment of genocide. But it misses the part of ethnic, right? It's only a forcible displacement of population. It was defined by the ICTY, by the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, by the court there, pretty well, but that hasn't entered into the Rome Statute. And the definition is very simple. Ethnic cleansing is an attempt by one ethnic group to remove another ethnic group from a territory that that former ethnic group wants for itself. Now, usually people don't like leaving their homes and their lands, and therefore ethnic cleansing is usually very violent because you have to force them to leave. Historically, going back to 1904, almost all genocides that have happened since then began as ethnic cleansing. the Germans in 1904 wanted to remove the Herero from areas that they wanted to settle. The Ottoman Empire wanted to remove Armenians from area where they were living because they saw them as collaborating with the Russians. The Germans wanted to remove Jews from areas that they controlled, and eventually, because they conquered more and more lands with more and more Jews, they decided to kill them all. So historically, there's a connection between the two. You asked about the case of 1948. There is a debate. I participated about 10 years ago in a debate. I argued that 1948 was clearly ethnic cleansing. I can't see that it was anything else, but that it was no genocide. Because the goal was, as this definition goes, was not to destroy the Palestinians as a group in whole or in part, but to remove them from areas that the Zionists wanted for their own state. There are other people who argue that it is genocide. How is that connected to the present? Well, what happened in 1967 was that Israel conquered the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, in which many of the people that it had already ethnically cleansed in 1948 were living. And now they became occupied populations of Israel. And because Israel has never quite made up its mind how to deal with that, in following October 7th, what it tried to do was to remove the Palestinians from Gaza, to destroy the Palestinian presence in Gaza. And one could argue, I think, quite reasonably, that the goal of the government and the army was ethnic cleansing, was to remove the Palestinians. But they had no place to go to. They were stuck there. And as a result of that, and the systematic destruction of everything that was there, and the killing and wounding of large numbers of people, ethnic cleansing became a genocidal operation. So that's a sort of links between the two. Now I'll try to respond to some of Michelle's questions. On the category of genocide and the Holocaust, so genocide is as you know, was defined in a particular way in the UN Convention on Genocide. Many cases that have happened before that definition was coined and after are relevant to it. That definition applies to them. Some are borderline cases. There can be a bit of an argument over the genocide in Cambodia. There's an argument over the Holodomor, the mass death of famine death in Ukraine in the early 30s. But there is a particular definition, and when you look at cases of mass crimes, you can try to decide, or the court in this case would adjudicate whether it conforms, these events conform to genocide, to the definition of genocide or not. You talk about naming. Now, when you, of course, the name Holocaust did not exist while the Holocaust was occurring, and in fact there were many other names to that mass killing of Jews. There were traditional Jewish names to it. Jews referred to it often as Churban or Churban, which is destruction. In fact, Raoul Hilberg, when he wrote his book, his important book in 1961, called it the destruction of European Jewry. When you call it destruction, especially destruction of Jews, especially if you use the Hebrew and Yiddish word Churban, you are linking it to Jewish history. because there have been many cases that were called Churban Yahadut, this or that, the destruction of this or that Jewry. There were people who called it Pur'anut in Hebrew, and Pur'anut is calamity. And there were many other calamities in Jewish history. Let's say the Cossack uprising of 1648. So the naming of an event links it, depending on who is doing the naming, links it to something else. And that is not within any legal discourse. That has to do with the historical national memory, collective memory, right? Of course, in Israel, the Holocaust is not called the Holocaust, it's called HaShoah. And Shoah is catastrophe. It's actually very close to the term Nakba, HaShoah, because there are many Sho'ot. There can be Shoah Teva, right? A natural catastrophe. If there were a massive earthquake in Israel, people would say Shoah Teva. But HaShoah, the Shoah, has become linked to that. The term Holocaust really appears in the 1960s and connects it, as somebody was saying yesterday, of course, to the Greek word of burnt offering. It's disputed. The countries like in France, they really don't like that term. They don't use it. They use the term Shoah. And they use the term Shoah because Claude Lanzmann in his movie called his movie Shoah, and since then it became Shoah. Until then, the French used the word Genocide. In Germany, the term that was used was Judenvernichtung, which is exactly what it was, the extermination of the Jews. But it was also the Nazi term. That's what the Nazis said they were doing, and that's what they did. And they started using the name Holocaust only after the miniseries, the NBC miniseries Holocaust came to Germany in 1979. So in that sense, naming has to do both with your national tradition. It has to do also with particular events, when a certain name connects to a certain event. But that, I think, is independent of whether we can identify an event as a genocide or not. If you make the analogy to wars, there was a world war. Everybody called it the World War, Der Weltkrieg in Germany. It became the First World War only after another World War happened. Before that, it was not the First World War. But now we know there's the First World War and there's the Second World War. And they have all kinds of very identifiable characteristics. They're different from each other. But both of them are world wars. We think of them as such, right? We know that a war can be very many different things. Even World War II on the Eastern Front was completely different from the war on the Western Front. So it has very many different characteristics, but we can say it's a war. It's not something else. Of course, the Nazis wanted, and many other countries that carry out genocide, like presenting it as a war. And it's our goal as people observing that or writing about it subsequently to say, no, this is not a war. The Nazis did carry out what they believed was a war against the Jews, but it was not a war. There was no Jewish army fighting them. There were just civilians that they were murdering. And unfortunately, that has become the case also with what the IDF was doing in Gaza. Until today, most of us talk about Gaza as a war. It hasn't been a war, at least since June 2024. There was no organized resistance. It was obliteration. And we use the term war as a misnomer because we don't know what to call it otherwise. We can say it's the Gaza genocide. We can say it's the ethnic cleansing. We can say it's the obliteration of Gaza. But it's not a war. So in that sense, there are generic terms. Specifically the case of Holocaust and genocide, that has a long history. Scholarship on the Holocaust began after World War II and accelerated in the 1960s, 70s, and then much more so in the 80s and 90s. there was very little scholarship on genocide. One of the first books on genocide came out in 1980 by Leo Cooper, a very important book. But it was one of very few. It was the most important book at the time. It's the equivalent, say, of Hilberg's book on the Holocaust. So the scholarship on genocide, in many ways, was based on the historiography of the Holocaust. And scholars of genocide learned from scholars of the Holocaust, how do you investigate these events? What are their characteristics? But there was a competition between the two. And that competition was partly disciplinary and partly ideological, because scholars of genocide who either wrote on particular genocides, mostly outside of Europe, and often dealt with comparative genocide, argued that the case of the Holocaust was so overwhelming that it marginalized other genocides. And that in that sense, their goal as genocide scholars was to expose other genocides and to release the hold that the Holocaust had on the study of other genocides. In other words, while genocide scholars were learning from Holocaust scholars, they were also trying to distance themselves from that. And there was, of course, an even more ideological argument that that appears already early on. It appears with Frantz Fanon already, arguing that the Holocaust was a case of whites killing whites. And the reason that it got so much attention was because it happened within white civilization. Whites killing whites on such a scale was shocking to Europeans. The other genocides were genocides by whites, colonial genocides, of people of other color, of colonized people. So that was an argument that the insistence on universalizing the Holocaust, on saying the Holocaust was the greatest genocide of all times, was marginalizing other genocides, and was also putting the killing of whites by whites on a higher level. Now, of course, the Nazis didn't kill the Jews as whites, they killed the Jews as Jews, and the whole argument of anti-Semitism was that Jews were not white, that they were Oriental people. So, I mean, I won't go into all of that. I'm just explaining what so there is a competition between the two. And that is one reason that there's a kind of insistence on saying Holocaust and genocide. There is the other side of it. The other side of it is the Jewish insistence, and increasingly the insistence in Israel, the insistence by Yad Vashem, by the national, by the Institutes for National Commemoration and Research of the Holocaust in Jerusalem, that the Holocaust is unique, that you can't compare it with anything, that any attempt to compare it, say, by saying that it's a genocide, okay, there's the Holocaust is a genocide, the genocide of the Armenians is a genocide. No, the Holocaust is separate. And that became part, in part, of course, every genocide is unique to its own group, right? The genocide is unique to Jews and Germans. It's the biggest genocide the Germans ever carried out, although they did carry out a few smaller ones, and it's the biggest genocide the Jews ever underwent, right? So it's unique to these groups. But the insistence of Yad Vashem and of Israeli politicians over time that the Holocaust is unique is, of course, an insistence for unique treatment. Because this is what happened to us, and because you did it to us, you owe us a price, and we have rights that nobody else has. So it becomes an ideological tool. That's what I was talking about yesterday. And again, that's why there's a tendency to speak about the Holocaust and genocide. Now, today in Israel, when you say that what happened in Gaza was a genocide, people deny it. The vast majority of people deny it. And they are happy to agree by now, yes, of course, there were probably war crimes, maybe even crimes, but you can't use the word genocide. Because in their minds, when you say genocide, you mean Holocaust. I had this conversation with an interesting guy, with a man called Moshe Bogi Ya'alon. He was minister. He was chief of staff of the Israeli army, and he was minister of defense under Netanyahu. But I've known him since I was 19. We were in officers' course together in the same platoon. And in between, I didn't see much of him. So both of us became officers, but he then became chief of staff. I didn't. But shortly before I came to Israel in December 2024, he was interviewed on Israeli TV. And in the interview, he said, what the Israeli army is doing in northern Gaza is ethnic cleansing. And the interviewer was shocked that he said that. He became a real hardliner. She said, did you just say ethnic cleansing? And he said, what do you think it is? Of course it's ethnic cleansing. So a week later I was in Israel and I met with him and I spoke with him about that, and I said to him what I said to you. I said, you know, historically ethnic cleansing ends up as genocide. And what he said to me, he said, well, but there are no shooting pits in northern Gaza. So the mental exercise that he was going through was very typical of Israelis. What he was saying was, there's no Babi Yar, that's the shooting pits, right? And there's no Auschwitz. And therefore, it can't be genocide. That's why even for Israelis who are willing to admit that the IDF committed terrible crimes, for them to say that it's genocide is almost impossible, to the extent that a very left-wing professor in Israel, what's his name? It'll come back to me. Said to me, don't use, Oren Iftachel, his name is. Oren Iftachel said to me, when you speak with Israelis, don't say genocide, say Retzach Am. But Retzach Am is the Hebrew translation of genocide. It's like in German, Völkermord. That's exactly what it says because if you say genocide, they think Holocaust. So all these sensitivities come to, explain this issue. Okay, just on the epidemic of denialism, look, I mean, I think I mentioned that yesterday. I wrote an essay on Israeli denial. Denial is actually a fascinating phenomenon in general, and everybody is involved to some extent, of course, in denial. It's not just Bolsonaro or Mille or Netanyahu or the United States or Germany denying for decades the genocide of the Herero, or Poland denying for decades involvement of Poles in the massacre of Jews, or Ukrainians denying denial is everywhere, or the French denying any connection between the French state and Vichy until 1985 when Chirac finally. So denial is ubiquitous, politically and individually. The Poles talk about the difficult past. The difficult past is the past you deny. The Nakba was denied for a long time. It came back by saying, okay, now we need the Gaza Nakba. So you deny it, and then you say, we didn't finish the job at the same time. So that's a common mechanism. But I think you ask, what is the other side of it? And the other side of it is important, because Europe, and even to some extent, well, the United States for sure, And even to some extent Israel, for a while, certainly with the so-called new historians who have now mostly retired, went through a process of facing up to the past, of coming to terms with the past, of Vergangenheitsbewältigung. All these countries that I mentioned also did that. And that's very important. That's a crucial thing. I think there was that happened to extent in Argentina. I think it happened to an extent in Brazil. It happened in Peru. It happened in quite a number of Latin American countries coming to terms with their own brutal past, or brutal regimes, or executions, or dictatorships. But when you do that, of course there are forces that want to reverse that. And one has to know. By trying to come to terms with the past, by confronting that past, you are also releasing a lot of demons. And these demons will try to come back and push that past back to oblivion. And so it is, in a sense, a push and pull. And one is related to the other, I would say. I wrote about memory laws, a chapter in a previous book that talks about Ukrainian, Polish, and Jewish, Israeli memory laws. And memory laws have the same thing. When you pass a law to remember something, you are simultaneously forgetting something. It's always the case. Remembering is forgetting, not just in human biological memory, but also when you pass laws. What do you remember? The Poles want to remember the genocide in Eastern Poland by the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians want to remember the heroic freedom fighters in Eastern Poland. And so in Ukraine, you cannot speak about genocide because it besmirches the memory of the freedom fighters. And in Poland, you can't deny that it's a genocide. And in Israel, you cannot remember the Nakba as something that happened and that should be commemorated on the Israeli Day of Independence, because it undermines the whole notion of it. So it's always about what you remember and what you forget. And your last question was about IRA. Look, I mean, I think the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA, I mean, we spoke about the fact that the definition, the working definition of anti-Semitism that was produced for IRA is a really bad definition, and is being used and abused by many countries and organizations. And I don't think there's more to say about that, but I would say that there's a difference between, and it's connected to what I said before, there's a difference between entirely rejecting that definition, it's a bad definition, and there are better definitions, and there's no reason to use this one, so it's just politically pushed, and the idea of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. That Remembrance Alliance was the first time that European states took upon themselves to pledge themselves to remember and commemorate the Holocaust, which they hadn't done, and which they were deeply complicit in. Indeed, it was that alliance that forced East European states that wanted to join the EU after the fall of communism to accept their responsibility for what happened to their Jews during the war, and the degree of complicity of populations, governments, political movements in the genocide of the Jews. That was a good thing. It had all kind of strange repercussions. East European countries, A, resented that pressure on them, and B, were faced with a problem, because they now, with the fall of communism, could celebrate their national heroes who fought against the communists. But those national heroes were very often those who collaborated with the Germans, including killing the Jews. And even if they resisted the Germans, as the Poles did, the one thing they agreed with the Germans about was that it's a good thing that they got rid of their Jews. So IRA presented all these issues. And some of the anti-Semitism that you saw rising in Eastern Europe has to do with that. the notion of a double genocide that became common in Eastern Europe. Yes, the Germans came to us and did what they did to the Jews, and there were some bad apples among us, but generally we had nothing to do with it. And then the communists came and they ruled over us for 40 years, and they brutalized us terribly, and so many of them were Jews. That's the kind of counter-narrative to IRA. So IRA, I think, as such, and we shouldn't confuse the two, is actually important. And now I'll just quickly go to, okay, look, I mean, on the economic issues, I'm obviously not an economist, but I want to say clearly what we see in terms of populist movements, whether it's Brexit or what you see happening in France or in Germany, and in other ways, Trump's obsession with separating the United States from the international community, of tariffs on everyone. In different ways, it does have to do with globalization. It's a response to the price of globalization, which was done in a particular way that whatever the intentions were, it was banking policy that did not take into account social policies, and that led to either real suffering or at least a sense of marginalization and being held at the bottom by large numbers of people around the world. When Trump came to Britain and said that he supported Brexit, he was reflecting something. He was reflecting an understanding that he had, and I don't think it was intellectual, but he has good gut instincts. He understood the same thing that Bernie Sanders understood. He understood something about sentiments of people in England, in Britain, who felt both that they were being subjected to rules by some bureaucrats in Brussels as to how to produce eggs and how to feed their pigs that had nothing to do with them, but that were, they believed, controlling them. People whom they didn't elect, they had nothing to do with, and who were impacting them. And they connected that with the fact that the face of British towns, and certainly British cities, was changing with people coming from Europe, and especially, of course, although it had nothing to do with the EU, people coming from African countries, from Muslim countries, from Arab countries, and that sense of being both economically under the control of these outside forces and of being invaded by all these people from the rest of the world and losing their sense of comfort in their own little communities, that is what pushed toward Brexit, which was a catastrophe for Britain, of course, economically, and it didn't help anybody. But that was the dynamic, and I think you can expand that example to many countries that felt that globalization might have been good for big, anonymous, multinational corporations, but was not helping actual people on the ground. And because it was, as always is the case, it was accompanied by so much corruption and so much graft by governments, by corporations, the sense of corruption, of loss of faith in your own politicians, in your own representatives, also seeped in increasingly. So I think, yes, of course, there is a clear connection to these larger economic policies, and we see what it's doing now in the United States. These taxes by Trump are not going to improve the American economy. by a long shot. I wasn't entirely sure what the last question was. Could you? Yes, I mean, yeah. I mean, I think I spoke about this. This is, of course, the most common trick in the trade. That people who seek power will identify internal and external enemies. So partly it's this notion of divide and rule. You always identify some enemies, and partly it's common in the sense that you, by identifying internal enemies, whether they are your citizens, but they are socially or politically, they're Bolsheviks, or they're fascists, or whatever they are, or people coming from the outside, if they are migrants, if they're of a different color, you identify them as those who present a danger. And around this fear of outsiders, of foreigners, of people with different skin color, people who have a different religion, you can create a unity of the majority. What is interesting, this is of course common, and you can go back to ancient times, and there's nothing very modern about that phenomenon at all. What is interesting is how this plays into a kind of modern populism that speaks about democracy. Because democracy, of course, is not just the rule of the majority. Democracy is protection of the minority. And this kind of simplification of democracy, when you say this is what the people want, the people want those others who have come to us, who have invaded us, who are undermining us. We have to unite against them. You have to give us the power because we represent you, the majority, against that minority. That creates a solidarity of hate, of prejudice, and of violence. And using the terminology of democracy actually creates a new type of tyranny, and that we see everywhere now. That's something that is more typical of the modern era, I think.
Thank you, Professor Bartov. I think our time with our interpreter has now ended, so I will put my question about identity, Stuart Hall, and the possibility of the formation of identities on the line between the public and the private for later, some future date. But thank you very much for having come to talk to us. I think all of us have had very many ideas during your talk, and a lot of information in such an organized and clear way that we will not forget it. So thank you very much. I think this is a great inaugural lecture by our union, and a real great precedent for us to continue to think about how we can help young people form identities that are critical, conscious, and forward-looking. So thank you ever so much. And once more. Michelle.